Welcome back to another reading and correcting with me, Kindar, the Tiger Writes, and Ty, the Tiger Supervisor. These are where I read a chapter from one of my stories and correct it as I go. If you want to listen to these live, it's every Tuesday morning, 8 a.m. Eastern Time on Twitch, and if you are looking to support me, that is on my Patreon. Today we are doing chapter 4 of Stepping Wild. Yeah, of course I forgot. Tibs focused on his reserve again. It was his daily essence exercise aimed at building up his rank, rather than learning new ways to use what he had. Back, before the guild punished him and stripped him of the essence he had, he'd been somewhere between Rho and Lambda, although his multiple elements had made it difficult to figure out where he'd fit, especially since he hadn't been able to tell his teacher about it. He'd also broken through stages out of desperation at not being killed much sooner than he should have been able to. He'd cracked the walls of his reserve and filled his channel with it. It is essence. All the way when he'd been Upsilon, instead of it being part of how a runner became Lambda. Now the density of the essence in his nearly bottomless reserve was no more than that of when he was Upsilon, and his walls were unbreakable, it seemed. His problem was, in part, that he hadn't had to crack them the guild way. Bardic, wait, that should be K, shouldn't it? Bardic had been trying to kill him for protecting the dungeon, his friend Stowe, and in desperation he'd absorbed the man's essence. There had been so much, and his reserve had been small then, that by the time it was filled, the Darkness Rogue hadn't felt it. So he kept absorbing, forcing more and more into the already filled reserve, and the pressure had cracked the walls, filling his channel with it. Then the guild had taken his essence, draining him nearly to nothing. It had somehow undone that. Okay, no, when the guild had taken his essence, draining him to nearly nothing, it had somehow undone that. And he'd spent most of the last 2 decades rebuilding the strength of his essence to the point where he could force the walls to break. He'd been told how by his teacher, but he'd had to play at not already being there instead of paying attention to the method. He'd read about it, but the books were written by scholars, not those who'd gone through it, and they were filled with theories on the process instead of established method that worked. The guild made sure that kind of information didn't spread. So he focused. He channeled an element, air this time, and pulled essence from around him into the reserve until it pushed against the walls. He tried to force more of it in. Those walls weren't real. Neither were the minuscule reserve containing essence of the elements he'd had audience with. Those he needed to touch to transform his gigantic one from life essence into that element. And that element and change the color of his eyes in the process. They were all construct of his mind's, ways for him to have a sense of what he had. But they weren't real. He was aware of that, and he'd been certain that knowing it would have made this part easier. Another problem was with the books related not to the scholars writing them, but to the fact that when it came to the elements and essence, there were no words that properly describe what they were and how they worked. When he had to describe how water essence felt to him, he said wet and blue and peaceful. But the words were approximation of something deeper was the only term he could think of for it. So when a scholar who had spoken with uncountable number of adventurers wrote that the way to break the walls down was to make the essence as dense as it could be until the pressure itself became too much for the walls. They weren't lying, but it didn't convey exactly what he needed to do. It couldn't. There were no words for that, only approximation of them. That advice had led to improvements. Tibbs's essence was denser. Okay, actually, you know what? There's a mistake here. There's an actual mistake here. Um, he cracked the wall. He cracked the wall reserve all the way when he was upsilon. Now the density of his essence was no more than okay. He's managed to condense it so he's not. It cannot be upsilon because that's literally the starting stage. Uh, so I'm going to say rho. Da, 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 da. All right. That advice had led to improvement. Tibbs's essence was denser now than when then he'd escaped. I've actually said it right here. Then when he'd escaped the guild, based on that, he placed himself somewhere among rho, as the guild recognized the stages of power for runners and adventurers. He'd started as Omega when he'd been conscripted into being a runner before he'd gained his element. All runners started there, and most died before gaining the strength to attempt an audience and gain their elements. Upsilon had been how he'd returned from his audience with water, although because of the decision he'd made during it, his training had been complicated. He'd still grown in strength, although enough the guild eventually recognized him as a row by passing a test that relied on what he could do with the essence he had rather than how dense it was, since the guild didn't have a way to copy his sense of people's essence and how dense it was, as far as I'd been able to work out. The density increased naturally, although it seemed to have walls, another approximation where it needed to be forced beyond. Some came as part of training the body, some as part of training the mind, and some by acting on the essence itself. Tibbs had, Tibbs had done increased the density by acting on since outside of the which was part of the where? Tibbs had increased the density by acting on the essence. Since outside of a dungeon, he hadn't found a way for the kind of challenge that pushed him, which was part of the grammar of natural progress. Okay, had gone with increasing the density by acting on the essence. Since outside of a dungeon, he hadn't found the kind of challenge that pushed his body to the limit, to his limit, to their limits, which was part of the requirement for the natural progress of the essence density, as far as he'd read. He'd first tried just pushing more, forcing what he'd done when absorbing Bardic's essence, but through absorbing what was around him, same as he was doing now, and had and that oh boy. He'd first tried just pushing more. Forcing what he'd done when absorbing essence. But he'd done that through absorbing what was around him same as he was doing now, and that had allowed him to progress until he'd hit the first wall. And he couldn't remember what his teacher, Alastair, had told him needed to be done, and the books were no help there. Most adventurers just got it. And he eventually did, too, although the inspiration came from workers packing metal rings to be shipped. Before packing them in a crate, some were twisted, so they became smaller rings, slightly thicker, but able to fit within the larger ones in the crate, therefore fitting more in the same box. Figuring out how to twist his essence had taken time because essence wasn't a thing. It was what a thing was made up, what it could be, which were all approximations of what essence really was. He'd had to come up to understand, back in Craggle Rock, under Alistair's training, that essence was and wasn't at the same time, before he'd been able to advance. And here, he'd had to work at making his essence do something that wasn't part of what it was. How did he twist something that wasn't, but also was? He'd tried using Arcanus to change the property of the essence, but that simply gave him etchings that did nothing. And the Arcanus was written within the etching with the essence itself, so he'd had headaches for weeks trying to understand that one. And then, one morning, he just got it. He didn't remember how it came to him, but he'd realized that if essence wasn't, how could it take space in anything? And he'd simply pressed, and it had done something that he could only describe as twisting on itself, and he was certain the approximation came from the workers, and suddenly his reserve was half full of a denser version of his essence. He hadn't been able to recreate that and make it denser still, or how to undense it once his reserve was full again, in the hopes that the increase would crack the walls and cause it to spill out into his channel. But he couldn't stop trying, as he was now. He needed to become stronger than he had been, for when he figured out how to take on the guild again and bring it down for good. The ridicule of the thought hit and broke his concentration. He couldn't believe there had been a time when he thought removing the guild's leader would be enough. They weren't a gang, always on the edge of breaking apart, held together by their leader's strength and the fear they engendered. The guild was a complex machine where people were cogs and their actions the ropes that pulled it to work. There might be one person he could remove that would cause the whole thing to grind to a halt, but the guild was set up in such a way that nearly anyone could be replaced by those around them. But as ridiculous as the idea was, he couldn't stop looking for a way to make it happen. The guild had to be made to pay for the abuse they performed and allowed to be performed under their watch. Its reign needed to be challenged. And the first step was to grow stronger, regain what he'd had, then go beyond. He took hold of the essence in his reserve and pushed it against the walls, making it into a mesh the latest book he'd read described, so it would interlock and act against the wall. Once the technique was mastered, the scholar's books had promised, the break would be achieved. Tibs felt like cursing them to the abyss, but he kept at it. He had ample time before the caravan reached the city with a dungeon or library. "What is he doing?" The whisper came from his left, a youthful voice. "I think he's sleeping," the companion whispered back, the voice just as young. "Guards can't sleep," the first one countered. "The old man in charge keeps them awake, then they have to leave." Tibs shifted his attention fully. He'd sensed them approach, the same he sensed those at the edge of his pulled-in range, but like them, he'd ignored these two in favor of his training. Yet another hour spent focusing and nothing to show for it. Many of the merchants and artisans traveled with their families, often also involved in the same trade or helping with it. But it also meant children. Rigel had a liking for children that Graydon didn't. Actually, that's spelled with an I. That Graydon didn't share. Tolerating them was the best way Tibs could describe the chief's interaction with them. Poke him with a stick, they whispered. You do it. I said it first, so you have to do it. What if it makes him angry? Tibbs opened his eyes and turned his head in their direction. What if I have magic? They bolted behind the tree with a scream, then poked their heads out. Guards don't have magic, the blonde-haired one said in a confident tone. Is that so? Tibbs smiled and pulled a copper coin from his pouch and set it rolling over his knuckle. Come close. Don't worry. Oops. Don't worry. I'm not going to hurt you since you didn't poke me with a stick. I told you we shouldn't do it. Their blonde hair had a copper sheen to it, looked at their friend, sibling. There was a uniformity in their face that made Tibbs think they were related. My mama says that guards are bad people. Someone keeps in their place. Tibbs made his expression quite serious. Your mother is very wise, but the old man is around to keep me in my place, so you're safe. It was their turn to have a serious expression. The blonde one looked at the other. Tibbs then stepped out from behind a tree. With a suspicious expression, their companions followed, eyeing Tibbs as if he'd used magic to get them moving. They watched the coin as it moved over his knuckle. With a jerk, he sent it up and caught it between two fingers. If I can't do magic, he held the coins at their highest height, moving his other hand to pass between it and them. How did I do this? As soon as the coin was out of view, he let it go, catching it and holding it in his palm. Their eyes went wide when his fingers reappeared, minus the coin. As a demonstration that he couldn't have it in his hand, he turned his palm side down. Tensing it to hold the coin in place. Where did it go? The copper sheen child asked, awed. I don't know. Tibbs replied with a baffled wait, what the? With a baffled expression. Wow. When I do that, the coin, what the hell happened with my typing here? The coin just vanishes. He studied them. But copper is drawn to copper, so with a quick motion, he ruffled the hair, then pulled the hand away amidst the protest, again holding the coin in his fingers. Their hand froze, fingers in the air, then they shook them, looking around for any coins that might have dropped. Tibbs kept from laughing in delight at their youthful antic. How do you do that? The blonde-haired one asked. Well, Tibbs stretched a word, both for drama and to consider his answer. What is the coin made of? Copper. The tone made it clear they thought little of him for not knowing that. But what is copper made of? They exchanged a look, and the other said with little confidence, metal. And what is metal? This question was met with confusion. Metal is an element. He elucidated for them. And the coin is made of the element's essence. Everything is made of essence. The ground, the trees, the stones, the wagons, the air. He smiled. You. No, we're not, the copperhead one proclaimed. I'm made of me. If there's an essence, the other said, expression serious, and the ground is essence, too, how come I can touch this? He stumped a foot, and not this. They waved their hand in the air. Tibbs smiled. That is a very good question. It's because essence is Nagello, Nirna, get away from the man. A woman yelled as she ran in their direction. Mama! The blonde hair One called to her, "He's telling us about magic." "I said, come here," she ordered. Dragging their feet, they... Okay, actually... No, I'm going to say. "I said, come here," she ordered. Dragging their feet, they obeyed. "I am truly sorry they bothered you." She held them close. "I've told them to keep away from guards, but they're just children. Please don't be angry." "It's all right," he replied in as soothing a tone as he could. "I never mind children's curiosity." She eyed him suspiciously. The expression was so much like that of the copper-haired one, Tibs had no trouble smiling. Had trouble not smiling. "You're not like the other guards." He shrugged. "I'm just like the others. There's nothing..." The deep, booming laughter interrupted him. "Don't listen to him." Graydon became visible, approaching from where the guards' tent were set up. "Our Tyborg is something special, all right. He's a learned guard." He leveled an accusatory gaze down on Tibs. "He knows how to read." The revelation awed the children more than his disappearing quaint trick. He shrugged again. "I had this friend a long time ago who insisted learning my letters would be good for me." The man laughed again. "Listen to him. A long time ago. Have you even seen 20 winters?" They smiled. "I have, and they were very busy winters." Graydon laughed again. "Well, you better be done with all that thinking and scaring children with knowledge. I'm going to assign duties for the coming week." Tibs stood. "Don't worry," he told the woman, who still eyed him suspiciously. "Some sweets will make them forget all that horrible knowledge I gave them." He bowed and walked along with the chief of the guard. "You are a strange one," the man stated. "I don't know anyone willing to injure them." Children should be allowed their curiosity. Just wished he'd had that chance. That Mama had been there to answer all the stupid question about the world the child he'd been would have had. Tibs forced himself to remember what had been done to her, what those men had done, and his promise to make them pay once he found the city he'd lived in. Well, yeah, you know what? I don't need the then. Yeah, once he lived the city he lived in, then something easier to do if he could travel by transportation platform. Fought the urge to rub his left wrist. How far until Tarvin? Yeah. Oh wait. Oh, I have named the bleeping city. So this is Tarvin. I'm going to have to rename it in another chapter. Because I have... A few months still, Graydon answered. "Are you staying on past that?" "I don't know yet. It would depend on if he could mix it with the runners there." The man eyed him, thinking, "If you're leaving, don't warn Rigel. He's going to make a fuss. My man's gotten it into his head that you're lucky to have around." "Luck's not a thing." Graydon chuckled. "You are a strange one." Rigel led the caravan, looking after the merchant's mood while his man looked after their safety. All Tibs had done was deal with animals that could have been problems by chasing them away as soon as they came within his range. He couldn't do much at those distances. Etchings were more effective closer to him, but animals were easily scared away. "Listen up, everyone," Graydon announced when they reached the assembled guards. "For the next 9 days it's going to be..." and assignments were distributed. For Tibs, it was taking charge of wagons 6 through 9 with Sarbella. If there was an attack, it would be their jobs to make sure the wagons formed a box in which the people could in which the people could I don't need on them, in which the people could hide. Then they deal with any bandits that broke through the guards and headed for their wagons or the adjacent one. "And by the abyss," Graydon said to finish his speech, as he had the previous 3 times duties had been assigned, "if you have to kill one of those bastards, make sure it's not where near it's where none of the kids can see. Got that?" The answering yes was more cacophony than anything as they broke away to return to their evenings. Tibbs understood the merchants' and artisans' concerns. The men and women Graydon employed didn't look, or in many cases were, reputable. Caravan guards were people looking to get away from trouble they'd found themselves in, and often because they'd caused it. Caravans were an easy way out of a city for someone wanted by the guards. There were too many people, and caravans were too important to be delayed. It fell on people like Graydon to ensure those troublemakers didn't become so while working for Rigel. 7 had left the caravan within the first 3 days of leaving the city for causing trouble. Some were caught in the act by guards, other Graydon found. There were no ceremonies. They were ordered to grab their things and leave, or simply weren't there in the morning. Everyone assumed they decided of their own accord this life wasn't for them, and nothing more was made of it. Tibbs knew, because he'd sensed the altercation, that Graydon had killed one of them. He hadn't found out why, so he'd kept an eye on the chief in case he was someone who enjoyed killing. There had been no such altercation since, and Tibbs had noted the next days how relieved one of the merchants had been on finding out a different guard was posted with their group. Other than he traveled alone, Tibbs hadn't found out why she'd made him uncomfortable. Outside the cities, men and women like Graydon had to be the makers of the laws and their enforcers. Tibbs had worked for goods and bad ones over the more than a decade he traveled as a guard, and after 3 weeks decided that even with what the man had done to the woman, Graydon was one of the better chiefs to work for. And that concludes chapter 4 of Stepping Wild. If you are enjoying this, please leave a like. If you want to know when the next chapter will be up, subscribe and hit the bell. If you want to read this story, it is available. It is up for free on Royal Road. And if you want to read ahead of that, a good dozen chapters ahead, that is on Ream Story. And if you want to listen to these live, it's every Tuesday morning, 8 a.m. Eastern Time on Twitch and YouTube. Well, remember. The links are in the notes, and with that, I shall wish you a good day.